And the cost of emissions reduction is really not very high. I showed this in another context yesterday also. The cost in 2030 would be no more than 3% of the global GDP, in fact, possibly less. I want to mention another figure that we brought out in the fourth assessment report of the IPCC, that in 2030, there would be 6 gigatons of CO2 equivalent potential available for emissions reduction at net negative costs. So in other words, if we were to take the right actions, we can do so at negative cost. In other words, there are economic benefits in reducing those emissions. So what we would do with this path of mitigation is to see that the prosperity that the world would reach in 2030 would at best be postponed by a few months or the maximum of a year. And that, to my mind, is not a very high price to pay for avoiding some of the worst impacts of climate change. There are also major co-benefits of mitigation. These are in the nature of much higher energy security, lower levels of air pollution at the local level, and therefore huge health benefits. There would most likely also be much more jobs associated with a path of mitigation. And therefore, if we were to link policies, we would find opportunities for no regrets measures that would reduce greenhouse gas mitigations, but also produce several other benefits to society. So CO2 mitigation potential for 2010 without net cost in India, just as an example, was between 13 and 23% of business as usual scenario. There's also an equity dimension that we have to keep in mind, and Article 3 of the Framework Convention clearly states that there would be common but differentiated responsibilities that have to be kept in mind for mitigation. And therefore, accordingly, developed countries should take the lead in combating climate change. And there was also reference to the equal per capita greenhouse gas emissions allowance. But essentially what this means is that both developed as well as developing countries will probably converge towards a common per capita benchmark level. Now, the future we want, the document from Rio+20 also said, we recognize that improving energy efficiency, increasing the share of renewable energy, cleaner and energy efficient technologies are important for sustainable development, including in addressing climate change. So, in addressing climate change, through a very clear focus on energy policies, we would also be tackling the objectives of sustainable energy for all, which is an important part of what was discussed in Rio+20. Now, our special report on renewable energy found that renewable energy can accelerate providing access to the 1.4 billion people who have no access to electricity, and the additional 1.3 billion people using traditional biomass. Renewable energy deployment can reduce vulnerability to supply disruptions and market volatility, low risk of severe accidents, because renewable energy technologies are really inherently much safer in that regard, and that has to be kept in mind. Now, the good news is that renewable energy, even though it's not really getting a lot of attention by way of research and development, is already much cheaper than conventional forms for several applications. And you can see this over here: biomass electricity, solar electricity, geothermal, hydropower. All these are renewable sources. And you look at the costs, they compare favorably with those costs associated with conventional forms of energy. So therefore, I think we do have several areas where there is a niche for renewable energy, and this should be exploited on a large scale. We also examined 164 different scenarios which show the role and the share of renewable energy by 2050. And interestingly, this spreads between 11% to 77%. And all of this is related to sets of policies that can be taken into account. And therefore, the important message from this analysis is that if we want renewable energy to have a desired share in 2050, we would need policies in place today, because the response would be spread over a period of time. Committing to alternative development paths would require structural changes, both in developed and developing countries, in a variety of areas: institutional arrangements, geographical distribution of activities, demography, lifestyles, and consumption patterns. So I think there are several issues of bringing about a transition that we have to take into account, and these are intimately linked with meeting the challenge of climate change. One of the areas that was discussed in detail in Rio was the whole issue of a green economy. It's seen as a tool to achieve social, economic, and environmental sustainable development. It's a common undertaking. Each country can choose an approach in accordance with national plans and priorities, because this, as you can imagine, was hotly debated. And there were several things that these crosses tell you. Some countries were very cautious. It's difficult to define what a green economy is. And some may feel this approach impinges on national sovereignty. But I think the very fact that there was a lot of discussion on green economy clearly shows that the world is going to pay attention to this in the years ahead. And finally, let me end by giving you this quotation from Mahatma Gandhi, which basically says that either we can wait for catastrophe to overtake us because we are blind to what's likely to happen and we're living in a state of self-deception, or we can create a culture or use a culture that already exists with social checks and balances to correct for systemic distortion prior to catastrophic failures. And I want to mention two other quotes of Mahatma Gandhi, and these essentially can be linked to the fact that the world today is focused only on growth of GDP. We don't look at what the impacts of the current pattern of economic development is creating on human society at large, on the atmosphere of the world, and therefore what it does to the climate. And Gandhi rightly said, speed is irrelevant if you're going in the wrong direction. So for us to say that, our country is growing at 10% or 12% per annum, but at the same time we are destroying our natural resources and our global commons, clearly is not a good measure of economic welfare. And Gandhi was asked whether he would like India to reach the same level of prosperity as Britain. His answer was it took half the resources of this planet for Britain to reach its level of prosperity. And he asked, how many planets would India require? So I think we need to think of the green economy, sustainable development within the context of maintaining the stock of our natural resources, conserving the wealth of nature that we have before us, because we must remember that the ecosystem services provided by these natural resources is invaluable. And particularly for the benefit of the poor, this is something that we have a moral responsibility to be able to protect. Thank you very much.
Pachauri Sensei.
Thank you very much, Dr. Pachauri. So Rio Plus 20, the results and achievements that have been explained to us in relation to the special reports as issued by the IPCC, and also the several points that should be noted, especially by the developing the countries as well as the industrialized countries that have been emphasized, that the poverty that is interlinked with the climate change, and which may have a dire effect on the developing the countries, and also the extreme event, the special report has been quoted, and you need to improve on the livelihood of the people, and that is something crucial.